We're back for our third lesson in the Book of Ruth. I'm Kathy Brasby, and let's get started. In earlier lessons, which if you haven't had a chance to view yet, you might want to go catch them at some point, we have discussed the historical context of the Book of Ruth, and we have met Naomi, who has suffered some devastating losses. If you recall, first she was uprooted from her home in Bethlehem, taken to a foreign country, Moab, as a refugee because of a famine. All that is just part of the stew of catastrophe of her life. And then, in Moab, more loss. Her husband dies, and then her two sons. Naomi is a follower of God, and she hears that God has ended the famine in Bethlehem. Since the people there have food, why not return? There's really nothing for her in Moab. She is too old to be anyone's second wife, which is probably her best prospects as she returns, but that's extremely unlikely for a woman of her age. Really, she's returning to die, to just wait out the rest of her life in familiar territory. So her two daughters-in-law leave Moab with her. They've lived with the family a long time, and it just seems normal for them to stay with Naomi. And so they start on the road back to Bethlehem with her. If you remember, again, in our last lesson, Naomi said, "There's really no hope for you in Bethlehem. You will be refugees. You will be at the very bottom of the social status in Bethlehem. You may not even be able to marry as a second wife. There just isn't much hope for you there." So let's pick up our story. Naomi knows there's really no future for these two young Moabite women. She lets them join her at the beginning of the journey, but then she tries to send them back. So we'll pick up our story in Ruth 1 verse 11. But Naomi replied, "Go back home, my daughters. There is no reason for you to return to Judah with me. I am no longer capable of giving birth to sons who might become your husbands. Go back home, my daughters, for I am too old to get married again. Even if I thought there was a hope that I could get married tonight and conceive sons, surely you would not want to wait until they were old enough to marry. Surely you would not remain unmarried all that time. No, my daughters, you must not return with me, for my intense suffering is too much for you to bear, for the Lord is afflicting me." It's a pretty sad speech that she makes to these young women. But the bottom line is she is trying to protect them. There is really nothing for them in Bethlehem. There's little for her. There's nothing for them. As she says, she can provide no more sons so that they could have future husbands in the family. Widows in Israel were at the bottom of the social ladder. They were instantly at risk for abuse and sexual harassment, being taken advantage of in many different ways. They had no one to protect them. And they were easily identified because they wore special clothing as widows. At this point, Naomi is showing great love to Ruth and Orpah. She doesn't want them to come into such a dismal situation. They will be refugees and foreigners, Gentiles, pagans, widows, women. It just can't get any worse for them. Although we may label Naomi as deeply depressed, and she probably is, she is still capable of showing great love to Orpah and Ruth. She is willing to go back to Bethlehem alone and let them go back to Moab and try to rebuild a life for themselves. She knows if they join her in Bethlehem, they're both younger, and they will likely survive her, and then they will be stuck in a foreign country without even Naomi to help them through the ropes. So even though she is very sad, Naomi really is trying to protect these two young women. But in her words, we get the first hint of the Levirate law. It's an Old Testament law that will seem pretty odd to many of us today. But it is a Mosaic law, and it's a safety net for families. When a man dies without a son, his family name ends. And so this law provides a way to continue the family line. If a man dies without a son, his brother is expected to marry the widow, and the first son born to this union will be legally the son of the man who died. That kept the dead man's family name alive. It's an odd kind of a law, but it was something that was provided for in those days. And Naomi refers to that when she says she cannot produce another son for Ruth or Orpah to marry to continue the family line. Naomi makes it clear to them, prospects are hopeless. Elimelech's line is dead. And besides that argument that she can't produce a husband for Ruth or Orpah, there is the reality for these two young women to move into a foreign culture, and she knows that so well. Naomi knows what it means to be a refugee, to be an outsider, a foreigner, to be marginalized. She has lived through frightening vulnerability as well as poverty and hunger. She tries to protect Ruth and Orpah from those. So the route to be provided for in that culture for a woman was through marriage. Naomi knows there are no prospects for these two young Moabite women. As I said earlier, they are Gentiles, they are foreigners, and they are barren. No Israelite man will want to take them in. They will be the lowest of the low, and she doesn't want to expose them to that. Let's keep going. In Ruth 1:14, we read again, they wept loudly. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung tightly to her. Can't you just visualize the love between these women? Both Ruth and Orpah have lived with Naomi and her family for 10 years. She is their family. In those days, often a girl would be married by 13. So perhaps these young women are only in their early 20s, and they've spent almost half their life living with Naomi. But Orpah decides to return home. The text doesn't condemn her in any way for this decision. It just gives us a contrast. One goes home, Ruth decides to stay. So in verse 15 we read, so Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law is returning to her people and her God. Follow your sister-in-law back home. Naomi is really explaining what the stakes are here. Orpah is going home. And in part, she's going back to her Moabite God. Go join her, Ruth. The choice here for both Orpah and Ruth is not only between Moab, Bethlehem, it's also between Yahweh and Chemosh, the God of Moab versus Yahweh, the God of Israel. And we have a contrast here. And Ruth chooses not to return to the Moabite god Chemosh. It makes it even more interesting because Yahweh is who Naomi has been railing against. And yet Ruth chooses to stay with Naomi. That raises a lot of questions for us. So let's see what Ruth has to say about the issue. In verse 16, but Ruth replied, stop urging me to abandon you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I do not keep my promise. Only death will be able to separate me from you. Those are powerful words. It's a familiar passage to many of us because we've heard it used in many wedding ceremonies. That's appropriate. I think you can see here the context is broader than even the love between a husband and a wife. In this case, it is between two women who choose that commitment. Ruth's pledge to Naomi is a pledge to death. She is not returning to Moab, ever. She will die in Bethlehem. So Ruth exhibits an amazing amount of loyalty and commitment and presence. I will not leave you. Ruth will no longer follow the God of Moab, but she will embrace Yahweh, the God of Israel. This is an incredibly difficult path that Ruth has chosen. She has likely given up any prospects of marriage, which was the only way women in that culture could escape poverty and danger. If she is able to be married, it would be as a second wife, and she would have no voice in that. She is undoubtedly facing financial difficulties as they return pretty much penniless, and she has a challenge of caring for an older person who needs extra care. She will have to learn a new language, a new culture, the folklore, the traditions, even how to worship God. And she certainly is going to face rejection from some in Bethlehem who will see her as a refugee. And as I said, that piled on all the other burdens that she carries as a woman, as a widow, as a foreigner, as a barren woman. All these burdens she will carry going into a new culture. There won't be much kindness shown to her as an outsider. So why in the world did Ruth reject common sense and any self-interest? Why did she join Orpah and return to Moab? Well, I've mentioned earlier that the Hebrew word hesed, I think, is illustrated in the Book of Ruth. And I think this is maybe the first time we see it illustrated. We see here love and loyalty and commitment and loving kindness, but those words don't fully explain and describe what it is that Ruth is doing here. One thing that helps us understand Ruth's commitment is that she embraces Naomi's God. It gives us a little clue. Even though she has heard Naomi's lament against Yahweh, and she has seen Naomi's world collapse without any indication of intervention from God, yet apparently Ruth has seen something in the life of Naomi, perhaps Elimelech, perhaps the two sons, that helps her understand the nature of God. When you've lived in darkness for your entire life, even a glimmer of light has the power to pull you forward. Part of the power of the gospel is offering light in the darkness. Naomi is a light bearer. She has faith in God, even though she's flickering a bit right now. But she follows God, and Ruth chooses God. She is now God's child, and she will live as one. We see that decision made in the speech that she gives to Naomi. But this choice by Ruth just takes our breath away. What is she doing? Embracing a life of overwhelming hardship. What is she doing? But she is decisive here. She ignores her mother-in-law's explicit advice, and she has her own voice. She stands on her own 2 feet and makes her own choice. And we will see her ability to take a bold initiative more than once throughout this story. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped trying to dissuade her. Naomi doesn't answer. She has no more arguments. She just continues on in silence, and they go to Bethlehem. She accepts Ruth's decision, even though it probably seems to Naomi that Ruth has thrown her life away. So the two of them journeyed together until they arrived in Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole village was excited about their arrival. The women of the village said, "Can this be Naomi?" So their arrival causes quite a stir. Remember that Naomi left with a husband and 2 sons. Now she returns with just a young woman at her side. It appears that the women at the gate in Bethlehem may not even recognize Naomi. It is possible that 10 years of the pain and disappointment and grief that she has experienced has really changed her appearance. Naomi's face and her posture probably reflect her pain. So these women have to ask, could this be Naomi? 10 years has been hard on her. She returns to Bethlehem demoralized And she responds to these women. But she replied to them, this is Naomi, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Sovereign One has treated me very harshly." Naomi means pleasant or lovely. Mara means bitter. We get a taste here that Naomi blames God. He has treated her harshly. She may wonder, why didn't he protect her? She still acknowledges him as a sovereign one. And so the question may become, did he turn his back on her? Does he no longer love her? Naomi explains further, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? Naomi here accuses God of taking her from fullness to emptiness. So Naomi says that God brought her back empty. Ironically, as she says this, Ruth, who has just pledged her life to Naomi, is at her side. She really isn't returning empty, but her words in part reflect the culture of the time. A woman without a man is a zero. So now we have two zeros, in a sense, walking into Bethlehem. In a way, we have to feel bad for Naomi. She is in deep pain, grieving, lost, afraid. And all of this is intensified by her belief that she has lost the love of God. He has turned his back on her. Has Naomi lost God's love? Does he even still know her? With all of her loss, this is yet another one, and maybe the most overwhelming one. So let's continue. This has been a very dark chapter in many ways, as we have talked about loss and grief and difficulty and facing a life of poverty and no social status whatsoever, a dangerous life. Yet, there are nuggets of light. We talked about that a few minutes ago. There are glimmers of light, and Ruth has seen them. Naomi, maybe not yet, but they are in the story. There are hints of what's ahead for these people who have trusted God even in the darkness. I want to remind you in the New Testament of John 1, 4 and 5, where it's written, "In him was life, and the life was the light of mankind. And the light shines on in the darkness, but the darkness has not mastered it." Again, this idea of good news, of life, of light in the darkness. And that's where we're at in our story. It's dark, no question, but there are glimmers. And we face that sometimes today. Sometimes it feels like we are overwhelmed by the darkness of our circumstances. Like there's no hope, there's no way out. But there's always a glimmer. And if we believe that, and if we search for that, we may be like Ruth, who clung to Naomi and clung to God and clung to that glimmer of light. Naomi had revealed to Ruth something about the nature of God, and Ruth wasn't letting go. So we see an interesting reversal here, where Naomi at one point had probably been a glimmer of light to Ruth. We will see now and in the coming chapters how Ruth becomes the light to Naomi. Naomi just doesn't know it yet. And so as we close out this chapter, we are given that little nugget of hope, that glimmer of light at the very end of this first chapter, where it says, "So Naomi returned, accompanied by her Moabite daughter-in-law Ruth, who came back with her from the region of Moab. Now they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest." This kind of summarizes what's happened so far. Naomi is coming back to part of God's promised land. We understand, and they probably did too, that God is everywhere. He wasn't limited to the promised land. And yet there is something very special about Naomi coming back to God's land. And there's more. We need to notice this glimmer. There is no longer a famine in Bethlehem. Instead, they return at the beginning of the barley harvest. A harvest signifies abundance. So although they probably aren't aware of it yet, we see this glimmer of what's ahead and what God is about to do. The light is still shining. So in our next lesson, we will meet Boaz, and we will get to see Ruth make another bold and dangerous decision. So I hope you'll join me as we continue into chapter 2 in the Book of Ruth.